Was he on?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. And,
Mr. Meyer, if you like, I can let you know who's on the call from the committee.
yes, please.
All right, so
Yes,
we do
please.
have
Go ahead.
Mr. Aguirre. I do see Mr. Walkinshaw. I'm actually just going visually through the top. Obviously, you're
Okay.
on. I believe, is Mr. Snyder on? Perhaps not. And I see that Mr. Turner is on. He's not a member of the committee, but we're glad he's joining us.
Hi all.
And so we are missing a couple members of the committee, but we also do have with us a number of our legislative staff from throughout the NVTC region. So those are the others who are participating. I also know we have staff watching on the YouTube.
Senator Evan is also on, Kate. He hopped on while you were. Yes.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I'm just driving from Richmond. We just ended our special session for the day.
It was a busy day. Thank you.
Sure. Now, Kate, do I have to read any of the statements?
I'm happy to do so if you would like.
Well, I don't mind doing it, but just from a legal perspective, I'll go ahead and read the statement. Since this is actually a formal meeting of our committee. All right, given the ongoing COVID-19 public health emergency, we're conducting this meeting electronically. We're doing so under the law signed on April 22nd by Governor Northam, a legislative amendment to the budget bill to allow public bodies to meet electronically without physical quorum present to discuss and transact business statutorily required or necessary to continue the operations of a public body. The NBT staff followed the procedures and guidelines in the legislative amendment to give notice to the committee, commission staff, and the public. Commissioners and staff have been called in using an audio teleconferencing platform, and the meeting is, we're not going to be on YouTube, are we, though? Are we?
Yes, we are. This is simulcast.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Okay, so this will be simultaneously broadcast to the public on YouTube. The only visual component of this meeting is the presentation of slides, which are being shown to those on the WebEx and on the private live stream. If possible, please mute phones or devices when you're not speaking to help cut down on background noise. Please note that you should mute and unmute through WebEx. For everyone who is connected by phone, please make sure to mute your computer speakers to reduce audio feedback. I'm now going to ask Zach Smith, who is the NVT's program analyst, to call the roll. I think we've already done that, but I think we can dispense with that. And then NVT staff that's on the call includes Kate Mattias, Executive Director of the NVTC, and the Vice Chair of the 3% Cap Working Group, Kate, and then Alan Fry, who's our Programs and Policy Director, and Amy Perrin-Siebert, who is our NVTC Legislative Liaison. Do we have legislative liaisons from the counties present as well?
I do have a number of them, and some are also watching on YouTube. So you don't need to.
Okay.
You don't need to say their names.
Okay. All right. In advance of this meeting, the NVTC solicited written comments from the public. Staff captured the public comments via Google Forms on our NVTC website. Comments received by 3 p.m. today were provided to the commissioners and head of the meeting. Zach, did we have any comments?
No comments.
Okay. So let's return to the first item on the agenda is the March NVTC Legislative and Policy Committee meeting summary. Now, this summary is being provided after the meeting for review by the committee, and please send in the edits that you have. Now, I'm going to recognize Kate Mattias, who is our Executive Director, to ask if there's anything that she would like to add at the very beginning here.
Sure. Again, it is great to see everybody together. It's been a long time, obviously, since we've had a legislative committee meeting, so we really appreciate you all getting together. Obviously, the fall does end up being a busy time as we prepare things together. And so this is really the first time that the committee can touch base as we develop our legislative agenda for the next calendar year. So again, we really appreciate all of your considerations. And obviously we have a wealth of knowledge on the call from our jurisdictional staff as well as our own staff within Nvtc. So again, we're just looking forward to the conversation. There's been a lot of legislative action by the General Assembly in particular over the last couple of years related to transportation. And so obviously we want to see what that looks like moving forward. And so because we obviously do have a special session that's going on right now, I think the first thing that we want to do is hear from Amy about what things are happening right now to sort of get us thinking about what we may need to look at moving forward.
Sure, happy to do that, and I'll be pretty brief because I know we talked about it a lot at the Nbta meeting last week, so I think we're all fairly up to speed. But the items that we are following here that are still alive, we obviously have the TOT issue that will probably come up again, dealing with evictions. So I think we're going to try to stay in contact with the advocates on that so that we can make sure that anything that they do moving forward, dealing with landlord-tenant acts, hotels, that there's a balance on the taxing issue. So that's something that we will keep on our radar for the 2021 session for sure. And then the two items that we are looking at is obviously the budget items with DRPT and with overall Secretary of Transportation providing flexibility within the program so that we can continue to make sure we can fund our transit programs here in Virginia. And so we'll be waiting to see when the budget comes out. The House and Senate budget should be coming out. I mean, we're hoping beginning of next week, maybe. They still don't seem to have any idea when those are happening. So that's out there. And then the other thing is Rip Sullivan put a amendment in for us, which we appreciate. And I know Senator Eben is aware of it too. And I think has talked to some of the members of Senate Finance staff about ensuring that we change that electronic meetings budget amendment that we just talked about at the beginning to make sure that our joint meeting that's required statutorily between CTV, Nvtc, Nbta, and VRE is able to be done electronically during this pandemic as well. And that's an item that we'll come to later because that's something that I think we need to probably look at for the 2021 session. But that's where we are. The House and Senate are finishing up their works on their bills. So we are the bills are actually starting to cross over now and being heard in other committees. The House is actually this House bills went up in Senate Judiciary today. So I think we're getting to a place where the bills are actually getting done and we're crossing over. So I think we're getting closer to an end. I'm optimistic that maybe we could be done by the end of September, but I would defer to Senator Eben on that. But it looks like we're moving forward. I think with a lot of these issues. So I don't know, Senator Eben, if you want to add anything to the special session update, I would be happy to hear from you.
Sure. I would love to be done by the end of September. We don't have a procedural resolution, so there's no official crossover date, but we have in the Senate, we only have Senate bills on first reading or second reading. We're meeting, I believe it's next week. So all the Senate bills except for the budget should have been completed hopefully next week, if not next week, by one day the following week. You mentioned the evictions. Could you just elaborate a little bit on what you were saying? It kind of went a little fast for me.
Oh, sure. There was, and maybe you remember, Senator Eben, Senator Locke had a bill. She actually asked for it to be carried over or to be on the table. But she had a bill that was going to allow people who were staying in hotels primarily as their primary residence to fall under the Landlord-Tenant Act. And we had some concerns up in the Northern Virginia area that this could affect the collection of TOT taxes. And we wanted to make sure that that wasn't an issue. So we've talked to Senator Locke. We've talked to the Virginia Property Law Center. They understand that this is a sort of a larger issue. So when they decided to lay it on the table, that we're going to talk to them more about it for the 2021 session.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And regarding what you had mentioned about the joint meeting in the budget, I'm glad that Rip has it hopefully in the House budget. In the Senate budget, Senator Howell is not interested in any amendments regardless. So I spoke to her about that, and she just didn't want to consider what I would call one-offs. So if it's in the House budget, then perhaps we can get it in the final budget.
Okay, thank you. That's important. I appreciate knowing that. I will. I'll make sure I'll talk to Delegate Sickles and make sure that it's in the in that budget. Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, and there are no, in the Senate in general, they were not accepting any budget amendments. I didn't
Correct.
think it would be that hard to get it in, but there was a lack of interest of getting started with the language amendments or otherwise.
Okay. Okay. Duly noted. Thank you.
Any, now, was there, I was a little lost on that last thing. My understanding was DRTP was looking to amend the budget to move the funds within some of their transit operations, taking it out from technical assistance. Is that what he was referring to at all?
Oh, no, that is in the budget. That is in the governor's, correct me if I'm wrong, Amy, is that what was in the governor's proposed budget?
Correct. Yes, the DRPT language is in the proposed budget. So what Senator Evan is saying is that they're not interested in taking any amendments beyond what the governor had already put down. So Delegate Sullivan's amendment for us is a separate. The House took budget amendments. The Senate did not take amendments from members. So it's a little bit of a different process on each side, which is unusual. Usually they both take budget amendments. This time they're not doing that. But the issue is the DRPT amendment is already in the budget technically. So that would be something that should definitely stay in there.
So Adam, you think that's going to survive and make it through?
I don't see any reason why. I mean, that's perfectly reasonable, and I don't see any reason why people would want to take that out, as well as the other. There was another transportation flexibility amendment as well that I think should stay in there fine. Or I'll certainly be advocating for them both.
All right. Okay. Other committee members, are there any questions of Amy at this point? Okay. Seeing none, then I'm going to ask Zach, excuse me, if he would give us a brief overview of our legislative and policy agenda.
Sure. So each year, the Legislative and Policy Committee developed Nvtc's Legislative and Policy Agenda. It basically outlines the Commission's priorities for the upcoming General Assembly session. This year, Nvtc's priorities are rather broad, but they ultimately center on protecting existing programs and revenues that fund transit and making it easier to access transit. So I'm just going to go quickly through this list here on the state priorities. And our first one is to connect people to opportunity through transit. And the idea behind this is to acknowledge that there are barriers to transit that exist. And we just want to be in support of programs or concepts that remove those barriers. So like I said earlier, this isn't in support of any particular bill in the legislature, but we just want to make sure that we are in support of any proposals or efforts to study any low-income fare reduction programs or provide fare discounts that address these issues moving forward. And so our second priority is to protect transit funding. Again, we just want to protect those funding streams and revenues that the General Assembly gave us in the last session, and to make sure that we have enough funding for our transit systems throughout Northern Virginia, including Ramada and VRE. Our next priority is along the same lines, and that is to preserve regional stewardship of regional programs. There have been some proposals in the past to sort of transfer the administration of some Nbtc programs to other entities, like the Commuter Choice Program. I haven't heard any discussion of that happening in Richmond this year, but we just want to make sure that we are in front of any sort of proposals that would do just that, and we want to make sure that we highlight the good work the Commission is doing in front of the General Assembly. Next on our list is to restore funding for Nbta. We just want to make sure that we restore funding that was lost from Nbta through the Ramada Capital dedicated funding deal back in 2018. I know the General Assembly did provide some restoration of those revenues in the last session, but I think there's still about $30 million that they are looking to restore. And finally, on the state side, we have a proposal that Amy mentioned, which is a bill to update the remote public meter requirements so that we can have some flexibility in holding those that required in-person joint meeting. Now on the federal side, we just, again, are requesting that Congress reauthorize dedicated federal funding for Ramada. This is part of the Passenger Rail Investment Act, or the PREA bill back in 2008, that provided about $1.5 billion over 10 years for Ramada to make needed state of good repair and safety improvement. And we just want to make sure that that funding is authorized. Following that, we have reauthorized the FAST Act and fixed the Highway Trust Fund. So the FAST Act, or our Surface Transportation Bill, is expiring at the end of this month. And we just want to make sure that if Congress proposes another bill, that it includes the necessary transit investments and funding that we need to see. And at the same time, we want to make sure that the Highway Trust Fund sort of addresses or has the ability to be sustainable in the long term, and that Congress addresses the shortfall with that. Also, we outlined identifying federal funding for Longbridge, and this is just to make sure that we call out Longbridge as a project with national significance, and that Congress provides either funding or financing to make sure to really repair and prioritize this link along the East Coast Transit Network. And finally, we want to support transit in any future COVID-19 relief bill. I believe the American Public Transportation Association is calling for about $32 billion from Congress to be sent to the transit industry. And if that were to take place, we want to make sure that transit is front and center in any future COVID-19 relief bill. Okay, Mr. Chair, I'll turn it back over to you. That was for any questions.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead.
It's Adam, Senator Evans. I had two questions. One is perhaps for Amy. In terms of the Nbta funding, given the fiscal climate that we've got where revenues are going to be down, I guess it doesn't hurt to ask the state for money, but is there any expectation after having just restored some of the funding this past year that the state would go further in the coming budget?
Senator Evan, this is Amy. I think that's an excellent question. I think everybody's kind of holding their fire on that and waiting to see what happens during the special session, and truthfully waiting to see if our economy rebounds by January. I think that's going to be kind of a wait and see item. I don't know where Nbta is at the moment. I think they're trying to do just what you're saying, which is kind of gauge the situation at the state. Obviously, if it's something that they don't think is going to be able to happen, but I think it's obviously a continuing ongoing problem of making sure that money gets restored. I think we obviously understand the current economic climate. So I think we're trying to be cautious and thoughtful about that. We'll probably be a wait and see at this point, sir.
Okay, yeah, it can't hurt to ask. I just think that I just think we should just be mindful that it's a tough economy. And I have one more question after that, but there was another response.
I was just James
Well,
Walkinshaw.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
I just wanted to jump in on the Nvta funding, and from Fairfax's perspective, obviously we understand the challenging fiscal situation that the Commonwealth is in, and looking at in the future. I think one thing that is important to note, and Zach or Kate or me can correct me if I'm wrong here, but unfortunately, a chunk of the restoration has been unsuccessful because the I-81 money has not quite generated in the way that I guess the projections expected. So, one of my fears is you have a lot of legislators in Richmond who kind of feel like, okay, we solved that problem and now we can move on, when actually a big chunk of it hasn't developed. Am I understanding that correctly, Zach or Amy or Kate?
I'm happy to chime in. This is Kate. Indeed, Mr. Walkinshaw, the projections, the reality of the revenue stream from I-81 has not met the projections yet.
And that was, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that was a pre-COVID reality. Probably has gotten worse since then, right?
Well, I don't know. I know truck traffic is still fairly busy along that corridor. It's been reporting, but I think it is important to know. I mean, this obviously is something that we will continue to do in concert with our colleagues at the authority, and move strategically with them on that, seeing sort of a unified front. My expectation of obviously it's you and the rest of the commission will decide on what goes into our legislative agenda. But whether it's now or in the future, keeping an eye on restoring the authority funding is what we've heard loud and clear from commission members, and that's why we're presenting it as a staff proposal.
Mr. Chairman, this is Mike Turner, too. Just a point of information. Right after I took over as a supervisor, I attended a VDOT orientation presentation of several hours, and they had a slideshow during that presentation, and they brought up this program and the amount of money, the algorithm they were using to calculate the amount of money that Nvta should receive. And I noted that the amount that they quoted on the slide didn't even come close to the calculated algorithm, the formula that they were supposed to apply to the money. And I noted that discrepancy, and they said, we don't know why, and we'll get back to you. There's a problem with the formula calculation. And I haven't heard anything since then, but I stuck it in the back of my mind as an interesting anomaly in addition to the lower traffic than expected on 81.
Well, I appreciate those observations. So I think that whether we make the full court press for the money, which maybe we should, at minimum, we should be doing education on the fact that what Supervisor Walkinshaw wrote and Mike, Supervisor Turner brought up about us falling short, just to start with. And I have one more question, if that's okay.
Yes, go ahead.
This is actually directed to Supervisor Walkinshaw as a former congressional chief of staff, and maybe to Kate. Does it make sense for us to invite perhaps representatives of our federal officials, whether it's to our December meeting of this committee, or to brief them separately by going to Capitol Hill or Zoom to Capitol Hill, whatever it is, about, you know, how pressing the situation is for Northern Virginia and Virginia as a whole? Would that be something that we could put on our?
I'll just obviously, you know, I follow Chairman Mayor's lead, but I think that's a good idea and a good point. And obviously, we're on all of these fiscal challenges for the Commonwealth and our localities. You know, our hands are kind of tied in our ability to solve the problems, but the federal government could be doing a lot more. So I think it makes sense to plan to be making that appeal, and I think we're fortunate to have a supportive delegation, but giving them a little ammunition as they're talking to their colleagues is always helpful.
And Mr. Chair, if I could,
I also think
I couldn't have planted this better. We actually, the commission has actually actively participated in letter writing, both with our colleagues at the American Public Transportation Association, as well as with the Transportation for America Coalition, very much pushing for additional funding. And again, we are very fortunate. All of the members of Congress in the Nbtc district, and of course, our two state senators, have been incredibly supportive of the need for financial funding for transportation. But I know we could probably do even more, but we do have a very good relationship with Congresswoman Wexton, with Congressman Beyer and Connolly, as well as, of course, our two senators, Kane and Warner. All of them have been very receptive to both the dedicated funding for Ramada, as well as relief funding, in addition to the CARES Act. I do want to add in, as we look to, we have reauthorization. The FAST Act is the major surface transportation legislation that's actually for both highways and transit, that's set to expire actually at the end of this month. There has not been any action on the Senate side for the transit title. And with the current configuration of the Senate, it's likely There won't be any under, depending on sort of how the leadership stuff moves in the Senate. The House did pass an actually fairly comprehensive reauthorization of the FAST Act, but there's just a disconnect between the House and the Senate right now on priorities and moving forward. Never mind with a second round of relief funding.
I'm thinking about James's concurrence on and Adam's idea about having a conversation with Hill people rather than having them come to the commission. At least initially have some staff conversations between the NBT staff and key members of the commission and members of the Hill. I think would probably be a good first step.
And we are just scoping our legislative briefing for December, and it will be virtual. So there is actually a chance that because of it being virtual, we may have a better chance of getting some of our congressional colleagues to be on the agenda or participate.
Great.
Now, do you think that should happen before November 3?
Our joint legislative briefing is actually December. It's already
What's
yeah. December 7th.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, let's make a note of that and see if we can't make that happen. But with respect to the restoration of funding, I appreciate Senator Evans' comments that with regard to Nbta, I think we should, without apology, be pretty straightforward about the situation. But we also need to recognize the realities so that so we don't appear to be tone deaf even to the members of the GA who are sympathetic and supportive of us. That we have to recognize the realities of the current situation, but be more of a gentle reminder and an encouragement that that we try to get these funds restored. And James is absolutely correct with respect to the realities on I-81. I was unaware that there might be some technical error in the algorithm above and beyond the fact that the revenues themselves have dropped because of lower traffic. Is there anybody on the staff conversant on that algorithm question? No? I do think that we might want to follow up.
There will be probably a good conversation of this at the authority's own legislative development discussion. They're probably the right folks to be following that very closely.
All right. Okay. Are there any other questions of the committee for Kate or for Zach on the agenda? All right. Any other comments that you want to make at this point? Committee members? Is there anything that we're missing on this legislative agenda? I think that there's probably a consensus that the principles that Zach laid out with respect to this moving forward and for the GA and in January, connecting people to transit, protecting our funding streams and revenues, preserving NBT's ownership of the commuter choice, and restoring funding for Nvta. I really think those are probably the overarching principles that we'll pursue this coming January. Anything else on that?
If I could, one of the things that we do expect that would go along with the legislative agenda is actually a piece that really gets into the value and importance of investments in transit. We often do that, speak to the economic and other benefits of transit and what it brings to Northern Virginia, what it brings to the Commonwealth as a whole. We will likely have that as a companion piece to anything that goes down, provided to our colleagues down in Richmond or on Capitol Hill. A big part of it especially for Richmond, is to celebrate all of the changes that have happened to legislation regarding transit in the last 2-3 years and ask that it's preserved. And so we're not really looking for much new, but recognize that what has been done is important, and we need to keep those different funding relationships still in place moving forward.
And I do believe that for those members that are, well, for all of the GA, especially for those who are sympathetic and supportive of the emerging issues of equity and social justice, that there is a direct linkage to transit programs and the concerns of that particular emerging social issue, that access to public transit has a direct relationship to jobs, food security, housing, et cetera. It's kind of stating the obvious, but I think that we ought to emphasize that as well.
Yeah, that's worth mentioning on our materials for Northern Virginia legislators. I think would be very in tune with that, to remind them of that.
Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
I'll give you one quick. Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to throw in one thing there on Vta funding, in the hopes that it might be helpful to Senator Eben as he champions our cause, as I know he will. For folks outside, for legislators outside of Northern Virginia, they have a stake in this too, because I can tell you what has happened is projects that we maybe would have funded with that Nvta funding, we're now submitting to VDOT's Smart Scale program. So I have a large project in my district that's in that category, and hopefully we're successful in Smart Scale. But if we are, that means we bumped someone else's project off of the Smart Scale funding list from somewhere else in the state. So your colleagues from outside of Northern Virginia would benefit if this funding is restored also, because we won't be competing with them as much for Smart Scale funding.
That's
Correct.
a good point.
That is a good point. Even though congestion mitigation is probably the highest scoring variable in the rankings, and by definition, Northern Virginia always seems to get a significant portion of that, still, I think Tidewater and the Richmond area in particular would benefit from your observation, James. Okay. Are there any other comments before that we can consider on this agenda this afternoon? All right, seeing none, staff, is there any additional items that you would like to mention before we adjourn?
I think we're happy. I think the next slide gets into process. There we go. Zach, do you want to go over, because we have some key dates.
Sure. So I'll just briefly run through this. So I know we are looking at another date to have this group meet in the fall, where we can discuss our final legislative policy agenda. And I know we want to get that one pager out with some other messaging and talking points. And then we have the commission who is set to approve the legislative and policy agenda in December at their meeting. We've talked about this tonight, but we do have our virtual legislative briefing with PRTC on December 7th. And then we have the start of the 2021 General Assembly session in January. And so throughout that time, I will make sure to send along any sort of notice or email about any bills that are pertinent to this group as they're pre-filed with the General Assembly before the session starts.
Okay.
And as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we'd have the Northern Virginia legislative liaisons, participate with us. And as the jurisdictions start developing their own legislative agendas, we do a lot to do some cross-referencing, likewise with the authority and VRE. So we always like to make sure we're in alignment. So we have a very good relationship across those lines, and we'll continue to leverage that.
All right. I can't stress enough the importance of this December 7th virtual legislative briefing. This is our annual program that we have normally over in Moasdale Road in person. Staff has been able to work with the facility to ensure that we can get our deposit back, but this will be different. In some ways, we may be able to get a greater participation because some of our key people in Richmond would not have to travel up here, but it's going to lose a little bit of the dynamic because a lot of what happens there is not on the agenda but happening outside. But let's make sure that we all have that on the calendar and that we're going to participate and join that in that virtual meeting. Any other comments? All right. If there are no other comments, I guess we will adjourn the meeting.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer.
All right. All right. Thank you for your participation. Appreciate it.